For thousands of years, the most powerful empires on earth kept repeating the same fatal error. They marched onto the Iranian plateau with weapons in hand, convinced that the civilization could be erased from existence forever. The Macedonian phalanxes of Alexander the Great invaded these lands. Ruthless Roman legions advanced here as well. Arab armies arrived under the banners of a new faith, and later the fierce Mongol hordes of Genghis Khan swept through, leaving behind only towers made of skulls. Any other nation would have disappeared forever after suffering such a devastating series of blows. It would have dissolved into the vast genetic and cultural melting pot of history, just as happened with the Babylonians, the Hittites, and the Assyrians. Yet with Iran, something completely different occurred. Time after time, despite losing battles, losing capitals, and living through occupations, the Iranians did something no other people managed to do. They absorbed their conquerors. Within only a few decades, brutal invaders would begin speaking Persian, constructing Persian architecture, adopting Persian systems of governance, and even wearing Persian clothing. Again and again, the East seemed to digest both the West and the nomadic conquerors. How did Iran manage, from ancient times all the way to the present day, to force every major world power to reckon with it? How did this civilization preserve its identity? And how did it happen that Great Persia, a country with more than 5,000 years of history, eventually abandoned its legendary name and asked the world to call it Iran? This is the story of how a single nation created the concept of time we still live within today, transformed geopolitics into a sacred struggle between light and darkness, and learned how to lose battles while ultimately winning eternity. Older than Egypt. To understand the depth of this civilization, we need to rewind history far into the past. Traditionally, the Western world considers Mesopotamia, meaning Sumer and Babylon, or ancient Egypt, to be the cradle of civilization. In that traditional narrative, Iran is often pushed aside, and that is a serious historical injustice. Human evolution followed its natural path here as well. 50,000 years ago, Neanderthals dominated these territories, only to be replaced by Cro-Magnons around 36,000 years ago. But the real revolution began much later. Archaeologists have discovered urban-type settlements on Iranian territory, including the Jiroft culture and the Sialk ziggurat, dating back 6,000 to 7,000 years. Ceramic vessels from the 4th millennium before Christ clearly prove that one of the oldest civilizations on the planet developed right here, standing shoulder to shoulder with Mesopotamia and China. The first major geopolitical power in these lands was Elam, a state located in the southwest of modern Iran, with its capital in the city of Susa. The Elamites were so influential that by the 26th century before Christ, they were practically dictating their will to the Sumerians. But an even more astonishing event occurred in the 23rd century before Christ, when the Akkadian king Naram-Sin went to war with Elam. The conflict did not end with a simple truce. Instead, a written treaty was signed. It guaranteed Elam's independence on the condition that its foreign policy aligned with Akkad. Think about that for a moment. This is the first documented international treaty in human history. The Iranian world stood at the very origins of global diplomacy. Genetically, however, the Elamites were closer to the peoples of Mesopotamia. The people we call Iranians today arrived here later. Somewhere between the 20th and 15th centuries before Christ, nomadic tribes began descending onto this mountainous plateau from the north. From the steppes of Central Asia and the Caucasus, they belonged to the enormous Indo-European family of nations, specifically to its Indo-Iranian branch. Amazingly, their ancient language was closely related to Latin, Greek, and the languages spoken across Europe today, including English and Spanish. Settling on these lands, they began calling themselves Aryans, meaning noble, and named their homeland Aryanam Vaija, the land of the Aryans. Over time, this word gradually transformed into the familiar name we know today, Iran. They blended with the ancient culture of Elam and eventually formed powerful alliances. The most famous of these became the Medes and the Persians. They invented time. It was here, among these harsh mountains and endless deserts, that the main weapon of the Iranians was born. It was not chariots, and it was not some special bows. Their greatest weapon was ideology. Long before the appearance of Christianity or Islam, a religion emerged on the Iranian plateau that completely reshaped the way people understood the world. Zoroastrianism. For the ancient Iranians, life was not a meaningless chain of accidents, or simply the endless repetition of seasonal cycles. The universe itself was seen as a battlefield where a relentless cosmic war was unfolding. A war between Ahura Mazda, the transcendent god of light, truth, and order, and Angra Mainyu, the embodiment of absolute evil, deception, and darkness. Most importantly, Zoroastrianism clearly defined where this evil came from. The realm of darkness was believed to lie within the vast, nomadic expanses of Eurasia, the lands from which devastating raids repeatedly struck the Iranian world. To be Iranian meant to stand as a warrior on the side of light. Their culture, poetry, and entire concept of statehood were built on the idea that humanity must actively support the forces of good in this cosmic struggle. This worldview gave the nation an extraordinary level of unity. But Zoroastrianism did something even more profound. It was the first religious tradition in history to declare that time does not move in circles. Time is linear. The world had a beginning, creation, and it will inevitably have an end. A final confrontation between light and darkness will come. The world will be purified by fire, and a final judgment will follow. But how did this revolutionary idea spread across the world? When the Persians conquered Babylon in the 6th century before Christ, they freed the Jewish population that had been living there in captivity. Judea then became a province of the Persian Empire for nearly 2 centuries. During this long period of contact, Jewish thinkers absorbed several key concepts from Zoroastrian belief: the expectation of the end of time, the idea of linear history, and the concept of a final judgment. Later, these ideas would flow directly into Christianity and Islam. Prominent philosophers, including Friedrich Nietzsche, later acknowledged that Iran played a decisive role in discovering the idea of linear time, the intellectual framework within which humanity still understands history today. Half the world. One king. The first truly powerful Aryan state was Media, which appeared around 670 before Christ. The Medes did not remain dominant for long, but they managed to destroy the once terrifying Assyrian Empire. However, their supremacy ended at the hands of their own relatives, the Persians. In 550 before Christ, a man named Cyrus the Great, who was half Persian and half Median, united both peoples. He brought together the tribes of the Persians and the Medes, and from this union he began building what historians would later call the Achaemenid Empire. The first true superpower in world history, Cyrus was unlike many conquerors who came before him. When he captured Lydia, the Greek cities of Asia Minor, and Babylon, he did not destroy temples or enslave entire populations. Instead, he built his empire on a policy of respect. His successor, Darius I, expanded the empire's borders from Egypt all the way to the Indus Valley. Nearly 50 million people, roughly half of the entire population of the earth at that time, lived under Persian rule. Darius reorganized the empire into 20 administrative provinces, known as satrapies. He introduced a unified taxation system, minted gold coins called darics, and built an enormous network of royal roads along which the fastest postal system in the world operated. But history never forgives weakness. In an attempt to secure the empire from the nomadic threats of the north, Cyrus the Great led a campaign into Central Asia to fight the Massagetæ tribes. There the greatest emperor of his age met his end. The battle was so brutal that the Persian army was destroyed. According to the historian Herodotus, the Massagetæ Queen Tomyris sought revenge for the death of her son. She ordered her warriors to find the body of Cyrus. When they did, she cut off his head and placed it into a leather sack filled with human blood, declaring, "You thirsted for blood. Now drink your fill." Despite this tragedy, the empire survived. We are used to thinking that the famous Greco-Persian wars, including the legendary story of the 300 Spartans, ended with the defeat of Persia. But that is largely a Western myth. Yes, the Greeks managed to defend their independence. However, for the enormous Achaemenid Empire, losing a few distant cities was little more than a minor irritation. Instead of continuing an open war, the Persians simply changed their strategy. They began financing different Greek city-states, first Athens and later Sparta, carefully setting them against one another. Eventually, in 387 before Christ, the exhausted Greeks were forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty dictated by the Persian king, Artaxerxes. What Persia could not conquer with a massive army, it purchased with gold. Persia became the undisputed master of Greece without firing a single arrow. Alexander the Great. The real catastrophe came later. The Achaemenid Empire had grown so enormous that a weak central government could no longer effectively control dozens of different nations scattered across vast territories. A young and ambitious king from Macedonia took advantage of this moment. Alexander. In 330 before Christ, the Macedonian phalanxes crushed the Persian armies with ruthless efficiency. Alexander burned the magnificent city of Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the empire. It seemed that the 1,000-year history of Iran had finally come to an end. From the ruins of the Achaemenid state arose the Hellenistic Seleucid kingdom, ruled by Greek elites. Yet this was exactly the moment when the Iranian survival mechanism began to operate once again. Eastern culture, slowly and methodically, began to absorb its Western conquerors. Alexander himself eventually started wearing Persian clothing and adopted the ceremonial etiquette of the Persian royal court. The policy of Hellenization began to suffocate under the weight of the ancient Iranian worldview. By the 3rd century before Christ, the Parthians, an Indo-Iranian tribe, expelled the Greeks and created the Parthian Empire. Their ruler, Mithridates I, proclaimed himself King of Kings and the rightful successor to the Achaemenid dynasty. For 5 centuries, the Parthians relied on extremely mobile cavalry and the famous Parthian shot, successfully resisting the expansion of the Roman Empire itself. Roman legions suffered devastating defeats in the Middle East at the hands of Parthian forces. Then, in the year 224, a new golden age began. The Sassanid dynasty came to power, originating from the region of Persis, Furi, the homeland of the earliest Persians. They created a strongly centralized state where Zoroastrianism became the official religion. Society was divided into rigid social estates: priests, warriors, bureaucrats, and common people. The system attempted to establish a highly ordered meritocratic structure. Sassanid Iran became a major superpower that fought exhausting wars for almost 4 centuries. First against Rome and later against Byzantium, these conflicts were largely fought for control over Mesopotamia and the Caucasus. However, centuries of continuous warfare eventually drained the strength of the Iranian state. Conquerors became Persian. By the middle of the 7th century, the Sassanid Empire had become a wounded giant. At this moment, a completely new force emerged from the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula: the Arab Caliphate. In 651, the Persian capital fell, and the last Shah of the Sassanid dynasty was treacherously murdered. All of Iran came under Arab rule, and the era of the Umayyad Caliphate began. The Arabs brought with them a new religion, Islam, and a new language. Zoroastrianism, which had fueled Iranian identity for thousands of years, began slowly fading. For most civilizations, such a conquest would have meant the complete loss of cultural identity. This happened in places like Egypt or Syria, which eventually became permanently Arabized. But the Persians once again followed a different path. Various Arab rulers attempted to force the Persians to abandon their heritage entirely. Yet although they had suffered military defeat, the Iranians began striking back culturally. The Islamic Caliphate, particularly under the Abbasid dynasty, increasingly relied on Persian administrators, scholars, and poets. Arab caliphs adopted Persian systems of governance, and Persian intellectual traditions began shaping the empire from within. The Persian language did not disappear. On the contrary, it survived the collapse of numerous empires, and some of the greatest scientific works and poetic masterpieces continued to be written in Persian. The Mongol rulers. After the Arab domination, a true catastrophe struck Iran. In 1220, Genghis Khan arrived from the vast steppes of Central Asia. The Mongols did not merely conquer territories. They annihilated entire cities and destroyed irrigation systems that had existed for thousands of years. It seemed as if Iran would become nothing more than pasture land for nomadic tribes. Yet when the grandson of Genghis Khan, Hulagu, founded a Mongol state in these lands known as the Ilkhanate, something remarkable occurred. The harsh conquerors, who had grown up living in yurts, suddenly adopted Islam. Persian became the language of administration. They began constructing magnificent Persian mosques, crowned with blue domes, and started supporting local scholars and poets. By the end of the 14th century, history repeated itself once again. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, invaded these lands. He erected terrifying pyramids built from severed human heads. Yet at the same time, he deeply admired Persian culture. He brought the most skilled Iranian artisans to his capital, and his descendants, the Timurids, eventually sparked a genuine Persian cultural renaissance. Their courts became centers of refined miniature painting, poetry, and intellectual life. For nearly 3 centuries, Iran remained a boiling cauldron where political authority belonged to powerful Mongol and Turkic dynasties. Yet something extraordinary kept happening. After taking the Iranian throne, within only a few generations, these rulers themselves became culturally Persian. The Iranian cultural code completely reprogrammed its conquerors. Out of this turbulent 300-year period of shifting tribes and dynasties, eventually emerged a man named Shah Ismail in the earliest 16th century. He reunited the country and founded the Safavid state. It was the Safavids who declared Shia Islam the official religion of Iran. This decision permanently separated Iran culturally and politically from the largely Sunni Islamic world and from the Ottoman Empire. Once again, Iran forged a strong and distinctive identity. Why Persia disappeared. By the 19th century, under the Turkic Qajar dynasty, Iran entered a period of deep crisis. After a series of devastating wars with the Russian Empire, the country permanently lost the territories that today form Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. By the early 20th century, on the eve of the First World War, Iran had become a battleground for the geopolitical rivalry known as the Great Game, the confrontation between the British and Russian empires. The country was effectively divided into spheres of influence. The British controlled and extracted Iranian oil, while Russian troops were stationed in the north. Later, the Soviet Union even attempted to establish a communist republic in northern Iran. The country was suffocating under the pressure of colonial powers. But Iran would not be Iran if it had not found a way to respond. In 1925, Reza Shah Pahlavi came to power following a military coup. He pursued a strict program of modernization and industrial development. And in 1935, he made a decision that surprised the entire diplomatic world. For centuries, the Western world had called this country Persia, a name derived from the Greek word for the region of Pars. In Europe, the name had become associated with Oriental fairy tales, carpets, exotic imagery, and romanticized backwardness. Reza Shah declared that this had to end. He issued an official directive to all foreign embassies. From now on, the country must be called by its authentic ancient name, the same name its people had used for thousands of years: Iran, the land of the Aryans. This decision was not merely linguistic. It was a political statement. We are not an exotic colony. We are a modern nation with ancient roots. And the world must take that into account. The war for a name. The history of Iran has always been a story of dramatic turns. In the 20th century, the country once again found itself placed on the global chessboard between competing superpowers. Decades of political instability and foreign interference ultimately culminated in the Islamic Revolution of 1979. The monarchy collapsed, Iran transformed into a theocratic republic, and relations with the West were severed. Today we witness a fascinating historical paradox. In the mind of modern society, 2 completely different images of the same country exist simultaneously. The word Iran often evokes associations with geopolitical tensions, economic sanctions, conflicts, and grim news headlines. At the same time, the word Persia has not disappeared at all. Instead, it has acquired a romantic and almost mythical aura. Persia evokes images of lost grandeur, elegant poetry, flying carpets, and legendary empires. Two names, one land, and a constant struggle over how that land will be remembered. Across its 5,000-year history, this civilization developed a remarkable mechanism for survival. When confronted by Macedonians, Arabs, Mongols, and many others, it did not vanish. It absorbed its conquerors. Again and again, it reshaped them according to its own cultural mold. Iran stood at the origins of civilization and helped create the concept of time through which we still understand history today. Yet perhaps the most important battle is happening right now. Because sometimes behind the simple name of a country lies a quiet and invisible conflict. A struggle between who we once were, who we have become, and how the rest of the world chooses to see us.